Hey guys, today we're going to tackle solving quadratics using a method called completing the square. And we're going to see why in a minute. So the first example that I have here is x squared minus 2x equals 8. If I were using another method, I would want to subtract 8 from both sides to get my trinomial to be 0. But in completing the square, we're not going to do that. We want no constant term on the left because we're going to create our own, which is going to make this a perfect square, rather. Okay, so the way that we're going to do that is we are going to look at our x term. We're going to look at the coefficient of our x term. And we're going to take that coefficient and we're going to divide it in half. Okay, and in this case, 2 divided by 2 equals 1. And then we're going to take the 1 and we're going to square it. And 1 squared is obviously 1. So we're going to use that information now to create our perfect square. So what are we going to do? We're going to take that 1 squared equals 1, and we're going to add the 1 to both sides. Okay, so we have x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 9. Okay, now this should be a perfect square because I created it to be that. So let's see what we have. A perfect square means I'm multiplying something by itself, and it's going to equal 9 because we're not doing anything with that right now. Okay, so let's look at this. I know that my first term has to be x because x times x is x squared. And if I look at my constant, it's 1, and I know that 1 times 1 is 1. So the only thing that I'm missing is whether it's plus or minus 1. Now that's where the sign comes in. Because the sign of the middle term now, the x term, is negative, that means that I'm going to be subtracting. And remember, these two binomials have to be exactly the same because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write it as x minus 1 squared equals 9. Okay, now what do I want to do? I want to find what x is. And I'm not going to do that by having it squared. So I'm going to reverse that squaring process by taking the square root. And whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. Now, if I square something and then take the square root of it, I end up back where I started, which is with x minus 1. And that's going to equal the square root of 9. Well, I know that 3 times 3 is 9. But remember also that negative 3 times negative 3 is equal to 9. So the way that I'm going to show that is plus or minus 3. Okay, now I'm looking for 2 roots because ordinarily we have 2 roots. Sometimes we don't, but in most cases we do. And the way that I'm going to find both roots is to kind of create 2 pathways. So in the first one, I have x minus 1 equals positive 3. And here I have x minus 1 equals negative 3. Those are my 2 possibilities. Okay, I'm going to add 1 here to both sides. And I get x equals 4. So that is my first solution, my first 0. And if I add 1 to both sides here, I'm going to come up with my second 0, my second solution. Negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2, so that is my second solution. So my 2 solutions are x equals 4 and x equals negative 2. Okay, let's do one other example. Okay, now there are a couple of different things that you might see in this. First of all, this trinomial is equal to 0. Well, I want to get rid of this constant, right? I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. Okay, so I end up with n squared minus 7n equals negative 6. Now, the other thing you might notice is that 7 is not divisible by 2. But it's a step I have to take, so it might be a little bit more complicated. I still have to do it. 7 divided by 2 happens to be 3.5. Okay, 3.5 or 3.5. Usually it's easier to work with decimals. I'm going to take that 3.5. I'm going to square it. And I'm going to end up with 12.25. Okay, so now I'm going to use that information. N squared minus 7n plus 12.25 is going to equal, when I add the 12.25 to negative 6, I'm going to get 6.25. Okay, now what do I want to do? I want to factor this. Okay, and remember, they both have to be exactly the same, and they're going to be equal to 6.25. First term is going to be n. Second term, remember, is going to be 3.5 because that's what I started out with before I squared it. So 3.5, 3.5. Let's take a look. Okay, my middle term is negative, therefore it's going to be n minus 3.5. So let's rewrite this. N minus 3.5 squared equals 6.25. Okay, let's take the square root of both of these. Square root of this binomial is n minus 3.5. And that equals plus or minus. Remember, put this in your calculator, square root of 6.25, and that's going to actually give you 2.5. Okay, take my two pathways. N minus 3.5 equals 2.5, and n minus 3.5 equals negative 2.5. All right, let's see what we have to do here. I'm going to add 3.5 to both sides. And what happens here? I get n equals 6. Okay, and what about here? I'm going to add 3.5. I'm going to add 3.5. And n equals, and again, use your calculator if you need to. Negative 2.5 plus 3.5 is equal to 1. So your solutions here are n equals 6 and n equals 1. And you can always feel free to graph these to check your solutions. I always like to do that because I make a lot of mistakes. So always use your graphing calculator as your checking tool. And I hope the video helped you.